The first thing to understand is that the English language does not have an equivalent term. The reason for that is that we live in an individualistic, contract-based society, and Hesed belongs to kinship organized societies. So it's family-based. Um, and so you have to start with that understanding. And Hesed, in biblical times, was a term that referred to the sum total of the expectations and responsibilities of people who were members of a kinship association, their families, what the rights and duties that each member of the larger family association had. And it also applied to people who became members of such kinship associations through other means than being born into them. For example, marriage or adoption, or just bringing people in who were friends or allies or had other kinds of connections. They could become part of that kinship association with the same rights and duties as those who have been born into the association. So it's the collection of Hesed then summarizes the duties and responsibilities that people in such an association have toward one another. The earliest helpful studies of Hesed that I found was, specifically the dissertation of Nelson Gluck, who became an important Bible studies scholar in Israel in the 20th century. 1927, in a Dutch university. He was studying archaeology, but he recognized that this biblical term had not been dealt with adequately by scholars, and so he did a dissertation that is still classic and probably still one of the best, most helpful things that has been written on the topic. Well, I got interested in Hesed out of necessity because what I was really interested in is the gospel as taught in the Book of Mormon, which takes you quite directly to the concept of covenant. And to understand the Nephites' notion of covenant, I thought I needed to understand biblical covenant. And as it turned out, biblical covenant concepts had been through 2 or 3 revolutions in the 20th century. But the most recent, which I have found to be the most helpful, coming from Professor Cross at Harvard, was grounded in Hesed. And I realized that I had to find out a lot more about Hesed before I could understand biblical covenant. Well, again, it's to understand the idea of covenant in the Old Testament, and you have to understand Hesed. And I would think that Latter-day Saints, who are seriously interested in that concept, which we get through Abraham and so forth, the Abrahamic covenant and covenant Israel, that it's pretty much unavoidable. We have to go back and deal with that. And it's been tremendously enlightening to me because we live in a world where covenants, we tend to think of covenants as contracts. And as I explained in the covenant paper, covenants, as understood in ancient Israel, are not contracts. there's no question but what this research project has changed my understanding of covenant, and therefore has affected my understanding of my own covenants. I would say the main impact has come through the realization, recognition that our covenant with our Father in heaven isn't just between us and Him as individuals. Rather, when we take the covenant that He offers to us, we become engaged on a covenantal basis with His people, with all His sons and daughters, and that we have then a covenantal responsibility to, for example, to look out for the welfare of our brothers and sisters. Now, and I could expand on that at great length, but that certainly has been eye-opening for me, to see the breadth of application that that covenant has, or the expectations implied by Hesed have in our lives. What I've tried to do in this article that we're talking about is to examine particularly the Book of Mormon. And I found the Book of Mormon to be using the concept of Hesed even more openly and comprehensively than anything that's available in the Bible. So I think it's very clearly implied in the Book of Mormon, and I think the Revelations and the Doctrine and Covenants are also consistent with the same thing, but I haven't made that a formal study, and I don't think anybody else has. Well, again, the Book of Mormon is very clear in my mind. We have the limitation from a scholarly perspective. The Book of Mormon comes to us in English. English is the basic language that a scholar has to use in studying the Book of Mormon. But all of the verbal characteristics of Hesed as discussed in the Old Testament, or as it appears in the Old Testament, that family of terms, I should say, that are associated with Hesed, all occur in discussions in the Book of Mormon, which seem to be reflecting Hesed. Of course, the Old Testament's in Hebrew. Hesed is a Hebrew word, and so there is a necessary jump or inference from the Hebrew to the English, which can never be nailed down absolutely. I don't think I argued that directly in the paper, but it's kind of hard to imagine how Joseph Smith, writing in 1829, could possibly have incorporated a foreign concept, a concept foreign to American culture, I should say, so comprehensively and so successfully. No one in his situation knew anything about Hesed. 1927 is the first really adequate discussion of it. The answer is no. In the biblical studies of Hesed have to find isolated phrases and interpret their meaning through the context there. We don't have any dictionaries that were produced in 700 BC or 600 BC. And so there's a lot of debate between biblical scholars about what it means. But the but the Book of Mormon does have passages where it just kind of hits you in the face. And King Benjamin's sermon and what he tells his people after the sermon, I think is probably one of the first places I would refer people to read if they were interested in it, because King Benjamin is talking about the covenant, and he is talking about the implications of the covenant in terms of the Nephites' relationship to each other and to their Father in heaven. The concept of covenant in the Book of Mormon has not been studied carefully or exhaustively, I would say, from a textual perspective by anyone that I know of, including myself. I see what I've offered in this paper as an experimental initial effort. And so I think that people with different kinds of skills could push that quite a bit further, and I would love to see them do that. Most of what we have on covenant is not grounded in that kind of careful textual study, but is grounded on other kinds of outside sources. I was delighted when I heard President Nelson use the phrase covenant path in what was just about probably 3 years ago in a general conference talk. I did a little research on that and found out that it had been used previously by Elder Holland, and then before him by some of the sisters in the auxiliary presidencies. It's not a scriptural term, but it actually works really well for my understanding of the scriptures, and the gospel is presented explicitly as a path or as a way in the Book of Mormon. Those terms are used multiple times to explain the gospel, and certainly Lehi's vision talks about the straight and narrow path, or the path with the iron rod. And so the concept of a path associated with covenant is very much a Book of Mormon concept, and I think that our President Nelson and our current leadership in the church are using that kind of language today, which is, I think, wonderful. In the Bible, there is, as in much ancient literature, but non-biblical literature, there is a concept of the doctrine of the two ways, the way of evil and the way of good, the way of light, the way of darkness, the way of life, the way of death. And that does show up in the Bible, not only in the wisdom literature, but in other places, and it shows up in the New Testament and in other related writings. It's not developed anywhere as well as it is in the Book of Mormon. One principal thing I've learned in this process is that our Father in heaven brings us into his family as his sons and his daughters by covenant. He is our Father by covenant, as this was understood by these early prophets. And so the idea of covenant is a way, just to repeat, is a way that people can be brought into an existing family association or kinship association, be given all the rights and responsibilities of membership in that association without it being an association that they were born into. And so that ancient notion of covenant is, I think, very helpful in and enriches what we as Latter-day Saints may have gleaned already from the Bible or from the other scriptures. Just understanding the covenant is the means by which we become a member of God's family. We've dealt in our conversation here with some of the key aspects of the concept of Hesed and covenant in the Old Testament and in the Book of Mormon. There are a lot of ins and outs to that that I've tried to deal with in these papers that are published in BYU Studies.